sfgov/citytest-sf. Again, welcome to the SFIC weekly discussion, Asian discrimination. Michael Pappas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Thank you for all of the support you give us. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this morning's online briefing for faith leaders. As the world struggles to cope with the deadly COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of xenophobia threatens many vulnerable communities around the world, with United Nations warning of a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating, and scaremongering. Since the start of the pandemic, people of East Asian and Southeast Asian descent and appearance around the world have been subject to xenophobia, with racist attacks against people from Asian countries and related hate crimes escalating. This week's online briefing for faith leaders, hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council in collaboration with the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management's Community Branch, will address the issue of coronavirus hate speech and crimes targeted at Asian people both globally and here in our region. And now allow me to welcome the Secretary of the Chairman of the Board of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Nancy Nielsen, to offer a word of welcome and our interfaith statement.
Good morning. It is such a delight to see all of you. Thank you for joining the San Francisco Interfaith Council this morning for this critically important conversation. Anytime we gather as a community, we read the interfaith statement from the council, and I'd like to share that with you at this point. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world.
Thank you, Nancy. And to ground us in a meditative moment, we welcome Reverend Elaine Donlan, Minister Assistant at the Buddhist Church of San Francisco and a member of the San Francisco Interfaith Council's Board of Directors.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning. I am very grateful to share this morning's meditation. I think it's a very important topic. We have a distressing history of hate speech and hateful actions against Asian people in our country, including but certainly not limited to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which actually was the first immigration law that excluded an entire ethnic group. And of course, in 1942, we had the Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the mass incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, men, women, and children, forced into 10 concentration camps here in the United States. The Buddhist Church of San Francisco was founded by Japanese immigrants in 1896, and they became the targeted group for hate speech and hate actions before, during, and after their incarceration in the various internment camps. And of course, we can't forget 9/11. The escalated levels of hate activities against our Muslim and other communities supporting them. For this morning's meditation reflection, I'd like to share a prayer that was recently written by Professor Reverend Duncan Rukin Williams. Professor Williams wrote one of the most critically important books on the history of Japanese American internment called American Sutra. And the prayer is titled Solidarity Sutra. And the last 4 lines, which he calls the Bodhisattva mantra, are 4 vows made by Buddhist schools in the Mahayana tradition. And they're vows to help, to serve, to ease the suffering of all sentient beings. Thus we have heard, at a time when physical distancing is required, yet social solidarity is so needed, the great physician Buddha offers medicine to alleviate the hurts of our world. A net of jewels, each a precious being, an infinite mirror to see ourselves. Interlinked is the rising wall of suffering. Interlinked are the efforts to surmount walls. Interlinked, we turn the wheel of the Dharma, turning views to see things clearly, turning hearts to know that we are not alone. Like a lotus flower blossoms above muddy water, drawing nutrients from darkest despair, discovering freedom in the midst of constraints. Solidarity, Bodhisattva, recite the mantra. Beings are numberless, we vow to liberate all. Delusions are inexhaustible, we vow to eliminate all. Dharma gates are boundless, we vow to study all. Buddha's path is unsurpassable, we vow to actualize it. Namandots. So this morning, may we open our minds to the suffering taking place in the forms of racist taunts and xenophobic actions. And may we open our hearts to realize that we are all each other's brothers and sisters in this preciously impermanent, yet profoundly interconnected moment in time. Thank you. Namandos. Namandos.
Thank you, Reverend Elaine, and bless you. Continue to pray for us. In its over 3 decades of service to San Francisco, the San Francisco Interfaith Council has always stood with the oppressed and has always spoken out in events of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism. And so when we were contacted by Chinese for Affirmative Action at the outset of the pandemic and asked to join our names to a resolution by the president of the Board of Supervisors here in San Francisco decrying hate speech against Asian people, it was natural that we should join forces. Once that article, once we did that, we received a call from the San Francisco Chronicle interviewing us on this particular issue. And the question was asked, are you going to do anything to follow up? And this particular gathering was my response to that question. Thought it was very, very important that our faith leaders have a bigger picture of this issue. And so we are very, very blessed to have with us today Cynthia Choi, the Executive Director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, a community-based civil rights organization based here in San Francisco. Before her presentation, we will see a brief video which she is presenting.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Secretary Azar says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why.
I think there's a great deal of misplaced fear directed at the Asian community.
In this situation, sometimes it's easy to move into perspectives in which there tends to be discrimination, there tends to be violation of human rights, there tends to be stigma on innocent people.
The moment really shifted the way I think about the larger Asian American community and this idea that we just have to stand up for each other.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the experiences of Asian Americans during this pandemic. And as was mentioned before, this is not new to the Asian American experience. And so I'm just extremely grateful to the San Francisco Interfaith Council and Michael, I appreciated the personal invitation. Gatherings such as this is more important than ever to build shared understanding, to connect us. that all has taken on a whole new meaning, and certainly to provide moral clarity and to offer solidarity is just so vitally important and so meaningful to us. Before I go into our work around anti-Asian hate, I wanted to share that our work in San Francisco and in the state, as well as nationally, has always been about building and strengthening our multi-racial democracy. Every issue that we've worked on, whether it's education or immigrant rights, economic justice, and advancing racial solidarity, has always been about making our country stronger and about inclusion. And this is why I think our work has really always been done with other communities, because we know that when one group is targeted, any of us can be, and this is the time for us to stand together. So again, this has been morally uplifting for me personally, as someone who has to read these multiple accounts of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. And I was really grateful for the meditation and the offering. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and share this. Can everyone see that? Full screen? Okay.
Go ahead and do presentation mode, Cynthia.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Perfect.
Let me go back. Oops. So the first thing I'd like to say is that we're doing this work in partnership with a group based in Southern California, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. And they have been instrumental because of their reach in Southern California, as well as the Asian American Studies Department at SF State. And I do want to make sure that I lift up the importance of ethnic studies and building knowledge across our communities. And this originally was an initiative that we wanted to start in California. And at the last moment, we said, well, why not take incidents from across the country? And lo and behold, we started receiving incidents of hate throughout the country. And we're so glad that we have, because no other tracker of hate has been able to account for or to be able to document the magnitude and extent that this is happening. So let's get into what we were finding. Before I get into the numbers and the data itself, I wanted to bring to life the actual stories that we were receiving. And to me, they are extremely sacred, because people have come onto our site and have retold horrific, dehumanizing, traumatizing experiences. And so if I may, I would love to read them to you so that you can understand the extent of what's happening. I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. Mother came up, put her hand on my arm. She didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk, how I look, and tell me to go home. But this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had since about 1977. My niece was at a local grocery store today, and this lady spat on an Asian family after insulting them by stating that the coronavirus was their fault. It's unbelievable where we are. I hope the store is going to make sure charges are brought against the woman. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable. My Korean boyfriend was at the store when we passed by an employee who stated, effing Chinese people spreading the virus and wearing a mask. My boyfriend confronts the employee, asks her to repeat what she just said, and she repeats it. The manager steps in and my boyfriend tells manager what happened. My boyfriend is angry but not aggressive. Manager asks him to leave or they'll call the cops. Unfortunately, we had received hundreds of these types of incidents. And actually the slide is outdated. We have close to 2,000 incident reports coming from throughout the country. And California has the highest percentage. We receive about 40%. And then New York follows that. In San Francisco alone, we have over 150 incidents. And I think that's really noteworthy, given, I think, perceptions around being multicultural and progressive. We know that this is happening here in our city and across the Bay Area. I wanted to explain that we were very careful in how we describe these incidents because a majority of the incidents that we're getting don't rise to hate crimes. There is an obsession with this idea of a hate crime and that there should be some kind of legal enforcement or there can be policing involved. But what I would like to say is that a majority are verbal harassment, and I don't want to minimize that at all because they are traumatizing, harrowing, and in some cases, people feel feared for their lives. We have an equal amount of physical assaults and civil rights violations. So physical assaults, as you know, can range from punching and hitting to more violent incidents. The most violent case that we know of is the stabbing of a young family, ages 2 and 6 children that were involved in Texas. And then we also have a category called civil rights violations, which constitutes workplace discrimination, refusal of services, accommodation, and discriminatory treatment. And both the physical assaults and civil rights violations in California, there could be some legal action that can be taken, and certainly that's a discussion that's occurred. But I want to just emphasize that we are particularly mindful of the fact that we don't want to contribute towards criminalization. If policing were the answer, if just having laws in place were the answer, we wouldn't be experiencing this level of hate. What we want to emphasize is focusing on making sure that we address this from an educational standpoint, that we use opportunities to build solidarity, and that we condemn all and any efforts that are trying to racialize and scapegoat any group. And through these efforts, as well as building our capacity as a community to address safety without involving police or the state, will be extremely important given the types of discrimination and hate that we're experiencing. As you saw, because we've been sheltered in place, the places that folks are experiencing these incidents of hate are limited to the grocery stores and pharmacies and big box retail, and also in their neighborhoods where people are walking and trying to get exercise. I was reading reports last night, which I do on a daily basis, and many of these incidents are happening while elderly are walking their grandchildren around the block just to get exercise and fresh air, and being harassed and attacked and verbally assaulted by neighbors. which is particularly sad to me. And I will say that prior to the shelter-in-place orders, many of these incidents were happening on public transit. We were also seeing bullying, anti-Asian bullying in the schools. And so when I talk about what we need to do as shelter-in-place orders are lifted, these are things that I think we have to keep in mind as we prepare for a potential surge or second waves of this type of discrimination. So who is this happening to? So as you can see from the infographic, all APIs are experiencing this type of hate, a majority being Chinese, and the intended target is Chinese. Because we know this because of the description of the incidents. The attacker believes that the person that they are targeting, harassing, is Chinese by the language that they're using and references. You heard some of the examples, many of them invoking Trump and the rhetoric that he's putting forth, and other types of conspiracy theories related to China bringing this virus intentionally and as part of their effort to take over the world, though that type of rhetoric has been fanning, I think, the rise. We also see that women are targeted twice the rate, or at least reporting that. And we just know that women encounter street harassment at a greater rate. And so the intersections around gender discrimination and being Asian is something that I think we're concerned of. Young adults are involved in, at least 25% of these incidents, both as perpetrators as well as being targeted. And we have about 10% of these incidents involve seniors. Some of them are more vulnerable populations. So what do we want to do? Of course, we knew that it would be important to have data and to have firsthand accounts, because we're a society that's obsessed with numbers and driven by that. So one of the things we want to continue to do is to be the lead aggregator of anti-Asian hate incidents. And this is really important because the 2000 numbers that we have, I just want to put that into context. That's over 8 weeks. Prior anti-Asian hate trackers that roughly started around 2016, over the last 4 years, have about 200 in total incidents. And so put that into perspective. We get asked a lot about, well, is this a rise? I would say yes, it is. If you look at the other tracking sites and what they've been able to account for. Dramatic rise. I would say that our tracking center also allows for limited English speaking community members. So we are able to track incidents from communities, 11 other language communities. And so the other aspect of what we're hoping to do is to offer multilingual services, resources for impacted community members. And I can provide examples of what we're talking about in a minute. But one of the things that we are seeing is that there's a need for mental health resources. There's a need for preparing members of the community who are very concerned about this issue. There's a recent poll that was done that 85% of Asian Americans are very fearful at this time of being out, going grocery shopping, returning to work, taking public transportation. And so there's a need to really respond to that. We are also providing technical assistance in developing rapid response and preventative measures. How are we preparing school districts, educators, parents for a potential rise in anti-Asian bullying from grade level through college campuses? We are working with human rights commissions throughout the country who are interested in being a resource and making sure that there are appropriate interventions. Fourthly, we are working with local communities to develop safety measures and to promote restorative justice efforts. Again, because we are seeing the types of hate really not having a legal recourse, and again, not wanting to criminalize various communities, we are wanting to promote this idea of how we can come together as a community to address safety in the same way that we have seen tremendous acts of social solidarity and mutual aids societies and local neighborhoods coming together to meet the needs of the most vulnerable members of our community affected by this pandemic. How can we convert that to address safety within our community and in solidarity with others? And then finally, as many of my colleagues have said, while education and love is very important, we also need policies that reinforce our values as a society. And so we would like to continue to work with local, state, and national elected officials to reinforce human rights and civil rights protections, and to make sure that we don't have a slew of anti-immigrant or policies that target any one group in the name of national security and public interest, because we know that this will have a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And that is something that I think we have to really come together around. We know that it's very important, for example, that we stand with the Muslim community in fighting the ban. We know that it's incredibly important as immigrant communities that we come together around the detention of families and family separation. These are issues that we need to continue to lift up in the same way that we should be outraged by the disproportionate deaths of African Americans, the Native American community. And here in San Francisco, over half the COVID-related deaths are Asian American. And so what is behind that? So I think these are all things that I think we can really come together around. And certainly, as been discussed in many, many different spaces, this pandemic has exposed levels of structural inequality that many of us have known for so long. And if this is the moment that we can come together to work on these issues, that would be, this is an incredible opportunity, I think, to do that. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the important work that we need to do that we've heard many times, which is, what can I do as an ally? We developed these 5 easy steps when witnessing. And again, I won't go through the training itself, but I'd like to just highlight how we developed these 5 tips. One is we wanted to center our focus on those who are being targeted. They may not speak English. They may have tenuous immigration status. They may be fearful of for their lives. And so it is so important, rather than to focus on the aggressor, to focus on the person who is being targeted. It would be important to really connect with the person that's being targeted, to make sure that you're in communication, if you can, about what they want to do, and to do it safely. and to be that moral support. Over and over again, we had read descriptions of individuals who reported incidents and said it was terrible to be targeted. It was shocking, but what was more disconcerting and sad was that people were around and they didn't speak up, and I felt extremely alone and isolated. This quote from Mia Mingus describes it all, I think, for the violence in our society, not just anti-Asian hate, that when most people experience violence of any type, we turn to our intimate networks, our friends, our neighbors, our partners, those that are closest to us, and may not feel comfortable contacting law enforcement. It's not something that they would want to do for various reasons. And so how do we build our capacity as a community to be able to respond and to support victims and survivors of violence? And this is something that we are currently doing in community. And of course, we wanted to provide resources to those who are experiencing hate directly, because again, those individuals were shocked, were unprepared, were paralyzed. And so we are offering these tools in multiple languages about focusing on safety, about remaining calm, and not feeling like you have to speak out if that is not something that you feel comfortable doing. And again, focusing on their safety and their well-being, to ask for help if that's something that they would like. And then again, to really seek emotional support however they can. Again, recognizing that as a community, we are not strangers to racism and xenophobia, and that in many cases, we want to be able to stand up and speak out. And we also are mindful of that various systems, state violence, police, may not be the answer for us, as we have often been criminalized by these very institutions. And that our work ahead of us is to really transform those institutions and to build solidarity across communities. So I just wanted to share, for those of you who don't know, stopapihate.org is our reporting center. And for those of you who'd like to contact us to find out more information, I'm certainly available. I want to just stress again that in these times, Asian Americans are also the essential workers. We are immigrants with mixed status, are very affected by the loss of jobs. And on top of that, we are underinsured and underinsured. We are part of the disproportionately impacted communities, and the additional layer of the fact that many of our community members, we all feel that fearful that we will be targeted, especially as society and our economies start to reopen. And the work ahead of us is really at the community level, building solidarity within our community and across communities. And we just so appreciate this opportunity to be in community with you. And I look forward to the conversations that we've had and that we're going to have today. So thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you for this very helpful and informative presentation. It exceeded expectations, and I want to let you know that you are not alone. You have allies, and we are very blessed to have with us today 3 particular allies from different sectors within our communities of faith, and I would like to invite each of them to talk about how this has impacted their particular faith community, and then ask a question of Cynthia on the basis of what she has shared today. so that we can exchange best practices. Our first faith panelist is someone I've worked with for 13 years, a colleague, a friend, and someone I admire and respect greatly, Maha El-Ganaidi, who is the president and the CEO of the Islamic Networks Group. Maha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. And this is the second time that I've heard Cynthia speak on the same topic, and I'm always impressed and very moved by her presentation. So thank you so much. I know that this is not easy for you or for your community right now, but we're all standing in solidarity with you. And I, as a Muslim, as an Arab American, along with the communities that I'm representing here, understand, sympathize, and absolutely stand in solidarity with you and Cynthia and other Asian Americans who are experiencing hate crimes. And that's partly because we also have been, for some time, targets of hate crimes and of bigotry so intense that it has also impacted other groups who are mistakenly thought to be Muslim or Arab, like Sikhs and Hindus. And of course, this is not a new problem for us. The Muslim and Arab experiences of hate crimes, of bullying of our children in schools, discrimination in the workplace, goes back at least as far as the first Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s, and even before that to the hate crimes Iranian Americans and Arab Americans experienced in the 70s during the Arab oil embargo. I was actually old enough to remember those, and then later the hostage crisis in Iran. And what began in the last century as discrimination against Arabs and Iranians has now grown to the phenomena we call Islamophobia, targeting not only Muslims, but anyone appearing to be Muslim. And based on my own personal experience and my studies, and I believe, and I think Cynthia and scholars would agree that I believe that the root causes of this bigotry stems from biased narratives that are rooted in colonialist history and which were constructed for the specific purpose of subjugating non-whites, non-Christians under an ideology of white supremacy that continues to live with us today in white nationalist movements, for example, that are also anti-Semitic and that have resulted not only in killing Muslims around the world, but also in undermining our nation's values and ideals. And these narratives have been embedded in every aspect of our society, in our culture, in education, in media, in Hollywood, and in television, in literature, to the degree that we ourselves have internalized it. And as Americans continue to be invested in these false narratives about Muslims, Asians, and other groups, they in turn support misguided policies against them, such as the Muslim ban, racial profiling in airports, surveillance of mosques, and so forth. So when a teacher, for example, tells a bullied Muslim child that I won't stop the bullying because I think your people deserve it for starting wars against us, which is something that actually happened in one of the San Francisco schools. That's an expression of gross ignorance that is based on what she believes about Muslims based on these historical narratives. Or when a lady sitting next to me on a plane confided in me about an hour of a really good conversation that she was afraid to board the plane because she thought I might blow it up. That also stems from these false narratives that were created about Muslims and Arabs. And this is what we now commonly call implicit bias. It's this visceral reaction one might have towards Muslims like me in hijab, a Black man, a Latino, a Jew, a Jewish person, an Asian American, a Native American, Sikh people, and so forth. And these implicit biases are not benign. It leads to hate crimes, discrimination in the workplace, in housing when I go looking to rent a place or to buy a place, in courts, in the justice system, and even in hospitals when we go in for treatment. So all of us, white, brown, and Black folks, have a stake in stopping bigotry and preventing hate, like the hate Asian Americans are experiencing today, because it undermines not only those communities, but it undermines our nation's values and ideals. So I think you might have answered this question, Cynthia, but I was going to ask you about the role of allies from other communities in helping combat the bigotry Asian Americans are experiencing. I think you've responded to that question, but I'm wondering whether there are different roles for different allies. Is there a difference between what a non-white, non-Christian community ally could do versus a white Christian community could do to help Asian Americans overcome and combat the hate that they're facing now?
That's such a great question. To be really honest, we have been so welcoming of all forms of solidarity. I think just to speak to the Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern and South Asian community, community leaders from the AMEMSA community were some of the first to reach out to talk about lessons learned regarding policies and the infrastructure that we need to build as a community to respond to all forms of hate. A particular concern has been the online organizing of white supremacy groups. And we are seeing, I think the difference today is that organization, the online organizing that's happening with white nationalist groups, white supremacy groups, is much stronger today. And they have been able to effectively promote and peddle these conspiracy theories. And of course, once you unleash them, it's very, very hard to unreel them or reel them back in. And it's spreading in such incredible ways. And so one of the things that we have been talking about is the fact that we need to continue to monitor those situations. And those conversations have been so helpful. What happened at Oak Creek in Kansas with the killing of the members of the temple? How do you respond? Do we need to come up with a rapid response system in places that don't have strong community organizations? What are ways that we need to come together continuously to educate each other about the developments and the types of harassment that individuals are facing? We are doing worst case scenario planning, which it's unbelievable, and yet not surprising that we have to continue to do this. So we have different conversations with different community members, and it's all based on, sadly, their own experiences and lessons learned. So that's kind of how we've been approaching it. And it's
can you just give advice, one thing that a member of white communities could potentially do when they witness a hate incident happening in front of them against an Asian American? What might they be able to do? It's riskier for me, probably someone like me, to do something because I'm a person of color. Just one thing that because people will be watching this across the country.
Right. Well, earlier I talked about what you can do if you're witnessing somebody being targeted. Okay. And it is true that when somebody intervenes on behalf of somebody who's being targeted, it's a distraction of for the person that's aggressor. And it might take on more meaning if the person is white, especially if the person who's being targeted doesn't speak English or can't speak up for themselves or is fearful of doing that. So I think that is one easy thing that you can do, is you see something, say something, and don't ignore the situation. So to me, that's a very simple thing that can be done. And I've seen it done very effectively to distract, again, the attacker and to, again, and make the other person who's being targeted feel like they're not alone. That is an incredible act of solidarity.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Maha, and thank you, Cynthia, for this incredible exchange. I want to welcome now Tyler Gregory, the newly named Executive Director for the Jewish Community Relations Council. I've known Tyler a number of years, especially during his time at A Wider Bridge, but the organization that he represents, the Jewish Community Relations Council, has been a strong ally of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and I would like to welcome Tyler and ask him to offer his words now.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's an honor to be here. And Cynthia, you know, our heart breaks for what's happening in your community. And I wish I could say that we're surprised. Unfortunately, it's a story all too familiar to our community. Maha laid out the case. You know, if you look at World War II with the Japanese internment camps, anti-Semitism followed limiting immigration to this country. If you look at the Cold War and the McCarthy scare, Jews were particularly targeted. During 9/11, with Islamophobia, conspiracy theories began to be assigned to Jews and Israel in ways that have been very troubling to us. So, you know, it was instinctual when we saw this beginning to happen that we knew we needed to mobilize the Jewish community in an organized response. And we're proud of the ad that we purchased in Tsingtao to really let the community know that we stand with them in this difficult time. Our Jewish community institutions, you know, we have a lot of shared connections there, like our JCCs in San Francisco and across the Bay Area. A personal anecdote before I continue. This issue is personal to me. My grandfather was born and came of age in Harbin, China. He was fluent in Mandarin and had a great appreciation for Chinese culture that he instilled in me and into my family. And when the Japanese imperial forces invaded China, he saw that destruction that took place. And that's what caused him to flee to San Francisco to start his family here. So I'm very Ashkenazi. According to 23andMe, I'm 99.7% Ashkenazi. So that's quite Ashkenazi. So you wouldn't know it, but this is something that means a lot to me personally. And so it's something that drives me to continue to stay engaged in this fight. But this isn't only important to us for allyship. And something that we're trying to do at JCRC right now is center Jews of color who are most vulnerable during this fight. And that's clear for African-American Jews, for Latino Jews, and we have many, many Jews of Asian descent that are feeling particularly vulnerable right now. And that's an educational opportunity, not only externally, but something that we need to do inside of our own community to educate our Jewish organizations and institutions that there are members of our community feeling particularly vulnerable right now. And it's been a beautiful exchange with Asian Pacific Islander communities, because I think in weeks that followed the publication of this ad, we've seen what's happened at state capitals. There's been anti-Semitic demonstrations against Gavin Newsom. You know, they had Nazi symbology against the Jewish governor, J.B. Pritzker in Illinois. You know, anti-Semitism unfortunately has followed closely in the footsteps of what's been facing the Asian Pacific Islander community. And so this is really part of the fabric of our being. And we know that when the fabric of society start to deteriorate, that Jews and other minorities are canaries in the coal mine. And the fact that we're feeling this now is an alarm to us, and why it's so important we all band together to protect our democracy, to protect civil discourse in a time like this. And so that's really what we at the JCRC are focused on. And we're so grateful that we have partners like all of you on this call. My question to you, Cynthia, is an interesting one. You know, one thing that I think hurts our ability in the Jewish community to educate our civic neighbors around anti-Semitism is many falsely accuse the Jewish community of being a community of privilege. And we know that there are some cases where that's true, but it's largely not true. And because we are white passing in many cases, we do enjoy some white privilege, but in many cases, it doesn't matter how much privilege we have, we know where it can go. And that's a false trope that's been assigned to many parts of your community as well. And I'm curious how you grapple with that challenge in trying to educate civic partners. That's something that I think maybe we can learn from each other. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're correct. That is a racist trope that has been certainly applied to the Asian American community. And this sense that because, you know, we're wealthy or our socioeconomic status is closer to white status, there's always been this sense of a racial hierarchy, and also like a sense that Asian Americans don't share commonality with the issues around structural racism. We tend to be used as a wedge to deny that there is structural racism. And I will have to say that there are parts of our community that had believed for a very, very long time that if we were the good immigrant, if we worked hard, if we you know, were employed in fields that, you know, didn't require us to exert leadership or to speak out, that just based on our merits, that somehow we would be accepted into society. And, you know, one of the things that we have been very, very cautious about is the fact that, as Andrew Yang learned very quickly in his perspective about, you know, we just have to prove ourselves to be more patriotic and to be the best American that we can be. Actually, no, regardless of your status, regardless of who you are, we are all human beings. And we do have to resist this notion of the fact that we have to be exceptional to prove our worth and our existence. Historically, we know how that's fared for us, and that it's important that we stay true to these ideals of everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect.
Thank you very, very much, Tyler and Cynthia. In the sacred text of the tradition I was raised in, we hear, "Show me your works and I'll show you your faith." We are very blessed to have with us today Reverend Deborah Lee, the Executive Director of the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. I have marveled at her work over the years, in particular recently protecting children at the border, but she has been at the forefront of addressing issues of immigration discrimination and inequity, and we welcome Reverend Deborah Lee.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Michael, for having this really important topic shared with so many people. And thank you, Cynthia, for the work of CAA in conjunction with the other partners and collecting this really important data. I think data in this case is extremely important, and a place for people to be able to call and to be able to report is so valuable. I just want to contextualize a little bit about, I think, what we're seeing in terms of the anti-Asian Pacific Islander violence, that this is coming in the context of the violence of the response to the pandemic itself. You know, the violence of the disregard, the ineptitude, the kind of disdain for human life, disdain for the American people, and in particular, that this is coming, this particular, when acts of violence happen and erupt at the individual level, like this is like reflective of institutional and structural policy. And which is also a form of, we've experienced as a form of violence. And I think I want to take this back to even like the rise of hate crime and the rise of violence, in my experience of structural violence, you know, since the 2016 election, of the hate speech happening institutionally and how it was manifest locally as well. And then to, you know, not to make it partisan at all, you know, this has also been part of a geopolitical context of the US versus China, which has been happening since 2009. This geopolitical setup between the new shift to the Pacific and seeing China as an enemy, both economically and militarily, that we know, and we knew that this was going to come someday and reflect back on our Asian American and particularly Chinese American communities here in the United States. So this is part of that context, and I think it's important to frame that these are predictable tropes and historical tropes, but they come at a particular point in history and a particular time and a particular expression of that. I also want to just mention that I think different communities are impacted differently. Like we all may be impacted by this sickness called racism and how that rears its head in times of crisis, but different communities might be impacted differently. Like we're seeing for the African American community, it's resulting in death. The death of the Stephen Taylor at Walmart in San Leandro, of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. We're seeing that these are continue to result in death while being Black. And whether you're sitting in your house or you're jogging or whatever, I think the impact on Asian Americans comes in a different way, and then the impact on Latinos also happens in a different way. Our organization, the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, has been looking at some of the structural violence that's happening towards immigrants, particularly through our immigration detention system. And not just immigrants, but also at our prison systems, which disproportionately affect the African American community in a huge way, and also Latino communities and also Asian American communities as well, who are in the prison system. So during this time of COVID, we are seeing that imprisonment and detention have become death sentences, de facto death sentences for people who are not able, because their freedom has been taken away from them, are not able to socially distance, are not able to wash their hands when they need to wash their hands, are not able to protect their own health, and their families and their loved ones are terrified. We have been pressing to raise this issue at the state level in California. There have been 20 deaths in California prisons, jails, and detention centers directly related to COVID. Some of them have come once people were released, and then they died in the community in our hospitals. So we know that this is not just an issue within prisons and confinement, but it affects all of our surrounding communities. And the health of the most vulnerable impacts all of us. Just this last week, I think on Monday, there was a suicide inside one of our immigration detention facilities here in California of a 74-year-old Korean American man who and his lawyers tried everything 3 times to try to get released from immigration detention based on his age, based on his vulnerability, based on his cancer, based on his other medical conditions, and was systematically denied 3 times by the government in order to be released to home arrest or some other form of safety. So this is just another example that how this connects, the kind of violence towards bodies of color in this country. One of the ways we're inviting congregations to support is that as we push for releases from those who are in immigration detention, which is completely unnecessary to be detaining people for civil immigration issues, is for congregations to be able to provide temporary housing as people are released from detention. Judges will not allow people out unless they have an address. And there are some people who have no family members who are here in the United States. And so congregations in the Bay Area, about 7 already, have been providing temporary housing for those getting released from detention. So we are looking for more congregations willing to do that, to RVs, Airbnbs, or even within their own empty congregations right now during shelter in place. So my question to Cynthia is, I'd love to get your thoughts on this time around in history when we're seeing similar patterns emerge. Where do you see us, how are we moving forward this time around? Are we moving forward this time around? Or do you see advancements in different ways that history isn't just repeating itself? It might be spiraling back to us, but that we are seeing things in a different way, trying things different way, responding in a different way.
I really like this question because I think this is where I get to be hopeful during a time of great despair and fear in our community and across communities. I'm seeing incredible acts of coming together, not just within the API community, but also across communities. I want to lift up the fact that We have former Japanese incarcerees who are continuing to lift up the fact that we are keeping people in cages, children in cages, with the very fact that no one had spoke up against them when they were being incarcerated as children. I want to lift up the fact that Asian community leaders have been working with the Black community to address anti-Blackness and xenophobia within our communities. I want to lift up the fact that we are recognizing the importance of being intersectional. And what I mean by that is to recognize that it's not just our racial identity, it's about class, it's about our immigration status, it's about the ways in which there are parts of our community that are privileged, but there are also parts of our community that are barely struggling to survive, are experiencing food insecurity, are being detained, are being separated from their families. And so with that, I really say that there's been a tremendous amount of connecting the dots, if you will. And to me, I think that is the foundation in which we are really looking at the connections around structural inequality, and how, for example, as the Asian American community, we're not relying on our state government, we're not relying on enlightened elected officials. We are trying to build our own capacity to ensure that we have the knowledge and the infrastructure to be able to respond in a way that doesn't, again, contribute towards the criminalization of other communities, but also ensures our safety. And that's really the only way that we can move forward. And I feel really heartened by that.
Thank you all. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Maha. Thank you, Tyler. And thank you, Reverend Deb, for this very rich and helpful conversation. This recording will be shared widely, and it is my hope that the participants on the line today and those who will view it will be inspired to stand up and to speak out against such iniquity and injustice. We want to thank you all, and I want to say a special thank you to some of the folks who helped make this recording possible. Cynthia Zambucas in our office, our program administrative associate, who really has worked time and a half, if you will, during the pandemic. And we want to say a very special thank you to the Department of Emergency Management's Community Branch Coordinator, John McKnight, who also happens to be the treasurer of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Kristen Lane, the lead production staff, Kelly Garrity, Karen Nemsek, Trey Russell Allen, and the rest of our team. We would invite you to join us next week. We're going to be taking on a rather difficult conversation, the importance of essential conversations related to end-of-life preparations in these times of the COVID-19. Before we close, I would like to invite John McKnight of the Community Branch just to say a brief word, if you will, about citywide testing.
And thank you all, and good morning to everybody here on this very important convening. I want to make sure everybody is aware that if you are a San Francisco resident or you're an essential worker coming into San Francisco to do your job, you can get tested for free. Every San Francisco resident can get tested for free. And I want to encourage you all to take advantage of that. Please, especially community leaders, I want to encourage you to take advantage of this. You can see on the screen right now, there's a link. Essentially, if you go to sf.gov and look up city tests, you'll find the link, but it's here on your page, and we can certainly send it out with the recording later on. The testing is extremely simple to sign up for. It's even easier to have done. It took me about 3 to 5 minutes total to get in and out of the facility. And the process is a way that we're going to take care of ourselves and our communities. And I want to recommend you go down and get tested so that you know what the process is like, so that you can then help to deliver this information to the communities and assure them of its ease. I recommend doing it now while you're healthy. Don't wait till you're sick. Don't wait till someone you loved is sick and there's fear in the air and it's a little bit more difficult to go through a process. Please, please, for all of us, I encourage you to go take advantage of this wonderful resource that's out there. I did it last week. Again, very easy. And with that, I thank Michael for the time to speak to this important resource we have available in our city.
Thank you, John, and thank you again to all of our presenters. This concludes today's program.